So today we're going to be talking about Module 5, Tools of Discovery in Older Brain Structures. So in investigating the brain and the mind, how do we do research on the brain and the mind? So how do we move beyond phrenology? So now we know that there are different areas in the brain that are associated with different functions, but how do we get beyond that? And so how do we get under the skull and under the bumps? By finding what happens when part of the brain is damaged or unable to work properly. And obviously we cannot play with this. This would have to be either by accident or experimentation on non-humans, or by looking at structures and activity of the brain using kind of CAT scans, MRIs, fMRIs, and PET scans. So strategies for finding out what is different about the mind when part of the brain isn't working normally. So if somebody's had a stroke or a part of the brain has been damaged or removed. So we have things like case studies, like the example of Phineas Cage, which we talked about last time, where he got the railway rod through part of his frontal lobe and the changes in his personality afterwards. Case studies of split brain patients when the corpus callosum, which are the fibers that interconnect the left and right hemisphere of the brain, are cut to stop severe seizures. Lesioning brain parts in animals to find out what happens. So if you cut out brain parts in animals and then find out what happens to their behavior. And then chemically numbing, magnetically deactivating, or electrically stimulating parts of the brain to see what happens. So we can study cases of brain damage. So when a stroke or an injury damages part of the brain, we have a chance to see the impact on the mind. So on the left we have the skull of Phineas Gage. You can see he was blinded. But so we know that when that, he survived, which, it looks pretty horrific if you see the diagram on the left. However, people said that he was not the same Gage after the accident because the frontal lobe is the part of the brain that has the executive functioning. And when that was damaged, his behavior became much more out of control. So it's kind of your filter. And so he would act on sexual urges. He was much more aggressive. There was not really a lot of filter to his speech. And so he was getting himself into a lot more trouble. There are also things such as intentional brain damage when we have lesions, which is surgical destruction of the brain. So you can see that on the right where they cut out a section of the brain. And this is performed on animals. And it's yielded insights, especially about less complex brain structures. So when we were able to kind of remove or lesion different parts of the brain, we can see how that affects the animal's behavior. It's no longer necessary now to do this type of experimentation, thankfully, because now we can chemically or magnetically deactivate parts of the brain to get similar information, which doesn't result in having to lesion and destroy that part of the brain. We also have split brain patients. So if you see the brain on the right, this is the corpus callosum, which is the fibers that interconnect the right and left hemispheres of the brain. And in some patients who have very severe seizure disorders, one way to stop the seizures from passing from one hemisphere to the other and making it much more severe is to cut the fibers. However, as a consequence, then the right and the left hemispheres of the brain can no longer communicate with each other, and some interesting things have arisen, and that's kind of the basis for some of the knowledge that we have, and we'll talk about that later. We can also stimulate parts of the brain to see what happens. You've probably seen all those commercials on TV where people have their brain exposed, and then somebody's stimulating their brain with electrodes and they become hungry or thirsty or whatever else. And this can be stimulated electrically, chemically, or even magnetically. And this can result in behaviors like giggling, head turning, or stimulated vivid recall. And so this way researchers can see which neurons or neural networks fire in conjunction with certain mental experiences and even specific concepts. So another way to learn about brain functioning is by monitoring activity in the brain. And we have tools that are able to read the electrical, metabolic, and magnetic activity in the brain. We have the EEG, which is the electroencephalogram, which are the kind of electrodes you put on your brain, and they read the brain's electrical activity. The MRI is magnetic resonance imaging, and that's the big machine that you stick your head into and can kind of produce 3D images of the brain and other organs. You have PET, which is positron emissions topography, which then you can see different areas of the brain activated, and functional magnetic resonance imaging is where you can actually see different areas of the brain working. So I mentioned the EEG is recording the electrical waves sweeping across the brain's surface. It's useful in studying sleep and seizures, and you can see on the right the patient has a lot of electrodes hooked up to her head. Dr. Gross-Pfeiffer here at John Jay does this kind of research, so you may participate in some of her studies. PET, or positron emission tomography, allows us to see what part of the brain is active by tracing where a radioactive form of glucose goes while the brain performs certain tasks. So certain areas of the brain light up. They might have you do like reading or singing or think about something, and then you'll see different areas of the brain light up. Magnetic resonance imaging makes images from signals produced by brain tissues after magnets align the spin of atoms. So the arrows below show ventricular enlargements in a patient with schizophrenia. So one of the things that they found consistently in the brains of people with schizophrenia is the ventricles, the area in the middle of the brain, tend to be larger. Functional magnetic resonance imaging reveals not only the structure of the brain, but also the brain activity and the brain activity. So it compares successive MRI images taken split seconds apart and shows changes in levels of oxygen and blood flow in the brain. So it's basically kind of the same thing as an MRI, just done in a series, and therefore you can see changes. So we're going to start talking about some of the different areas of the brain and their functions. So we have the brainstem and the cerebellum, which coordinate the body. These are the ones that are located in the back lower part of your skull. When these areas are damaged, though, you generally die because they're responsible for your breathing and heartbeat and stuff like that. The limbic system manages emotions and connects thought to the body. And then the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain, integrates information. And this is kind of the newest layer of the brain. So less complex brain structures. So we start with the brainstem, the pons and the medulla, followed by the thalamus, reticular formation, cerebellum, and the limbic system. So the brainstem, as I said, is kind of located at the back lower portion of your skull, and it's composed of the thalamus, reticular formation, pons, and medulla, which are the bottom part are the brainstem, right there. So the medulla controls the most basic functions such as heartbeat and breathing, and when this is damaged, as I mentioned, you die. So someone with total brain damage above the medulla could still breathe independently, but someone with damage in this area could not, and so they'd have to be on a respirator. The pons helps coordinate automatic and unconscious movements. So the thalamus is also known as the inner chamber, and it's our sensory switchboard or router. All sensory messages except smell are routed through the thalamus on the way to the cortex, or the higher outer part of the brain. The thalamus also sends messages from the cortex to the medulla and cerebellum. So the reticular formation is located there, kind of on top of the pons, and is a nerve network within the brainstem, which enables alertness, pardon my inability to speak at the moment, from coma to wide awake. It also filters incoming sensory information. The cerebellum, or little brain, helps coordinate voluntary muscle activity, such as playing sports. It also has many other functions, including nonverbal learning and memory. The limbic system, which is also known as the border system, coordinates emotions such as fear and aggression, your basic drives such as hunger and sex, and then formation of episodic memories. The hippocampus is in charge of conscious episodic memories, and it works with the amygdala to form emotionally charged memories. The amygdala, also shaped as an almond there, is consisted of two lima-bean-sized neural clusters, and it helps process emotions, especially fear and aggression. So when these areas are ruined, you'll sometimes see people, eating things they shouldn't be eating. Their emotions can be dysregulated, etc. So if the amygdala is stimulated in cats, it provokes a very aggressive reaction, as shown on the right. And if you move the electrode very slightly and cage the cat with a mouse, the cat will cower in terror. So you can see that you can go from aggression and fear, and it's all located within that same area. The hypothalamus lies below the thalamus, and it regulates body temperature, and it ensures adequate food and water intake, homeostasis, so it tells you when you're thirsty and you're hungry, and it's involved as well in your sex drive. So people with imbalances in this area might eat too much or too little, and they also might have hyposexuality or hypersexuality, so too much or too little. It directs the endocrine or hormonal system via messages